Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. The Prime Minister is on a tour of Asia. The question of China looms large, both in terms of what our future relationship is and how the Americans truly see it. We have witnessed the president signing a new deal with Australia on critical minerals, many saying that should have been our gig. And of course, we are looking at a budget in early November, and a lot of problems with our economic fundamentals here in this country. So let's go to the economic brainiacs on this one so that we can get a lay of the land. We have Sean Speer with us, editor-at-large and a co-founder of The Hub, and Trevor Tombe, who is professor of economics at the University of Calgary and co-director of finances of the Nation, a project in conjunction with the Canadian Tax Foundation. So where to start, gentlemen? Welcome. Why don't we just have a quick word or two on what you think the Prime Minister's plan is in Asia, sans China. He won't be going there, at least we're told he's not. Sean, do you want to start?
Yeah. Senator Wallen, you'll know that in the past couple of years, the Canadian government under former Prime Minister Trudeau set out an Indo-Pacific strategy which talked more frankly about China and its economic and geopolitical ambitions than any government in modern Canadian history, more than the Harper government, of which I was a part. And one interpreted it as a genuine shift in how Canada was thinking about its economic relationship with China, how it was thinking about security issues around China. This was in the context of the two Michaels and broader evidence that China was engaged in national security threats, foreign interference in our elections, and so on. And since then, the new Prime Minister Carney hasn't articulated his own vision for Canada's relationship with China, particularly in the context in which our trade relationship with the United States is not as reliable as it once was, to say the least. And so we had a Foreign Affairs Minister Anand go to China last week. As you say, there's a lot of momentum around the idea of trying to restore our economic relationship with China. It seems to me what we need from both major parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, is a clearer sense from them on how we're thinking about our relationship with China, how we put issues like the electric vehicle tariffs in this broader context. Right now, you get the sense that we're scrambling a bit, that we don't have a strategy, if I could put it that way.
No, we listened yesterday to, or the other day, I'm not sure when it was, François Champagne, the finance minister, sort of say, well, we've got to reduce tariffs with China, but it really, we're all sitting there looking at the canola industry, which is a $40 billion a year business that works and has built-in customers. And we're somehow putting this at risk, Trevor, for, doing what the Biden administration wanted us to do on Chinese EVs. Where's the thinking on that?
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of the engagement with China recently has been about. We've seen trips by many Canadian officials there, including, I'm joining you from Alberta, so neighboring premier of Saskatchewan went to China as well. I mean, this is a significant issue when there's tariffs by one of our main markets, not the largest. The U.S. is the largest canola market for us, but 100% tariff on canola oil, canola meal, some other items as well. And I should be clear, in addition to that, there are also tariffs by China on certain types of seafood and pork. So it goes beyond just canola. And this is in response to our tariffs on imports of China electric vehicles into Canada, again, following decisions taken in the United States. And so there's almost surely, it does certainly seem as though there are some very high-level discussions around walking back from some of those positions. Canada taking away some of the tariffs that we levied against Canada, and then China then stepping back from the retaliatory measures that it put in place. And this is quite important for Canada's economy. The canola tariffs alone are a potential multi-billion-dollar hit to that sector. And adjusting to that is really difficult. Having tariffs on EVs is also contrary to kind of some other objectives that we might want to have in mind as a country, not the least of which is maybe lowering emissions, also affordability issues. I mean, to the extent that people want to purchase electric vehicles produced elsewhere.
And the Chinese ones are cheaper than Tesla. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's that kind of competitive pressure that can, in the long term, strengthen the North American auto sector. We saw that with Japan in the 1980s. So, I mean, just in principle, I'm not sure it's wise to have these kind of very large trade restrictions on imports from abroad. It may in the short term prevent some disruption to the auto sector here, but long term, it just weakens it.
Well, especially in the absence, as I say, Senator Wallen, of some kind of framework that helps us make sense of what our strategy is. In the absence of that, our policy feels scattershot and reactive. One gets the sense that the EV tariffs are less about some kind of strategic consideration as much as it is protecting the massive public subsidies that the government has plunged into the EV industry. If the government wanted to make the case that there was a national security issue around Chinese EVs, I'd be all ears. And in fact, if the government was prepared to make a more fundamental case that we need to revisit our broader relationship and think of something like decoupling, at least in particular sectors or technology, similarly, I'd be all ears. But if you're a canola farmer in Western Canada, you get the sense that this is not some broader agenda or broader strategy. It is responsiveness to muscular special interests in the auto sector in central Canada at the expense of canola farmers and Western Canada. And that's a tough pill to swallow in the absence of policymakers bringing Canadians along and helping them understand how this fits into a broader reconceptualization of our relationship with China.
Now, I think this is in part how we should be. Trevor. This is kind of in part how we should be viewing the Prime Minister's trip to Asia. So he will be visiting several countries: Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, I believe. And these are countries that we have free trade agreements with. Malaysia and Singapore through the TPP, and South Korea on its own. And so there may be discussions there on how to increase trade volumes with those countries, or at least that's how it's being communicated. And then the Prime Minister attending the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Summit may provide an opportunity. There's been some reporting that the Prime Minister and President Xi might have a potential meeting at that summit. And so while Carney is not visiting China itself, he may very well engage with the president.
Yeah. So what does this, but put this in the context of our relationship with the United States. The president isn't exactly clear every day on his position vis-a-vis China either. Whether he's re-engaging one day and having a summit with Xi, and then the next day signing the deal with Australia over critical minerals, Sean, and then saying this is to kind of, we don't need you, China, because we're going to get them from Australia. Two things, like says something about China, also says something about Canada. We should be providing those critical minerals.
Well, there's so much to say in response to this, Senator, and there's the precise point you make, which is Canada should be bringing to the table in our bilateral relationship a reliable supply of critical minerals that don't just have commercial applications, but obviously have broader geopolitical and security ones. But on the broader point, one has to start with a high level of sympathy for the Carney government. They are dealing with a series of second best options here. The president's positioning, not just vis-a-vis Canada, but vis-a-vis other countries around the world, is unpredictable to say the least. But I come back to a point I think we've discussed previously. We've published analysis at the Hub by Trevor and others that Canada does more two-way trade with small U.S. states than it does with most other countries in the world. And so as frustrating as this all is, as much as one would be inclined to just throw his or her hands up in the air, the only way through is through with the United States. We need to come to a deal. And if I can just make one broader point on this, especially because we're speaking on the 21st of October. There's some reports this morning that in coming days, we're going to have some narrow arrangement with the United States on steel and aluminum and other areas. I think if I can make one small p political criticism of the Prime Minister is on these talks, he's not brought Canadians along. His position seems to essentially be, trust me. And yet we don't understand what the trade-offs are, what the different considerations are between, say, EVs and canola or steel and forestry or any of the number of issues that we're dealing with. And the political risk for the Prime Minister is he presents a fait accompli final deal whenever that is, and Canadians are surprised to discover what's in it. One of the inherent challenges of a kind of technocratic government, if I could put it that way, is that trade negotiations are ultimately an exercise in trade-offs, and they require small d democratic legitimacy. And I think the way that the Prime Minister has gone about both his pursuit of new economic relationships in Asia, but in particular his ongoing discussions with the United States, is risking kind of failing that small d democratic test.
Yeah, it's such an excellent point, because this, you can kind of have too much information, as we watch out of Washington every single day, where the president's stream of consciousness, but people are seldom surprised by what the president is up to or what he thinks about whoever he has sitting in the room with him. There's some confusion, needless to say, on the Russia-Ukraine front, but honestly, this inability to communicate, and even to ministers, because we have ministers saying things out loud that have not clearly been signed off on by the PMO, the Prime Minister's office. So there is a lot of that. But Trevor, just to the really basic point, and I think sometimes we lose track of this because not everybody. Many people are so upset with Donald Trump and think he's the worst thing that's ever happened in the world. But our trading relationship with the United States is core and always will be. It's just proximity and size.
Exactly. There are basically two factors that determine the overwhelming majority of trade between countries, and that is, as you said, distance and size. And the U.S. is both large and close, and that is not changing. And we've had this conversation many times before. The last broad-based trade war that we had with tariffs and counter tariffs back in the 1930s also featured a very concerted effort by Prime Minister Bennett signing free trade agreements with Australia, with New Zealand, trying to stand up a broader Commonwealth free trading arrangement, and didn't really move the needle much at all on the importance of the U.S. in terms of our trade. If anything, we grew that direction of trade compared to others. And we've seen many trade agreements signed even prior to Donald Trump with the European Union, with TPP, with many other countries. And that's positive. These free trade agreements, to the extent that they lower costs and ease the ability of businesses here to access markets abroad, and consumers in Canada to access items produced in those countries that might be relatively better at certain things, that's all for the better. Boosts productivity, can boost growth and investment, and strengthen Canada's economy independent of what's going on in the U.S. And the trade policy in the U.S. has been fairly uncertain, let's say, over the past many months this year. And that's a challenge for business, no question. And therefore a challenge for investment in Canada and economic growth here. But they will continue to be. Dare I say forever, until we have Star Trek transporter beams or something. They will they will be the dominant market for Canadian business.
Or to get our products somewhere. Let me just stick with you for a minute, Trevor, because you wrote about this, so I wanted to come back when the Prime Minister was in Washington last and doing yet another 180 on our approach to dealing with the Americans. He said, I think stating the obvious, but you had to explain it, that we send trillions of dollars to the U.S. because we do business with them. Mm-hmm. People went, oh my God, what are we doing? We're broke and we're sending. millions or trillions to the United States. Can you just explain what he was saying there?
Sure. Our deep economic relationship with the US goes beyond trade and goods and services and also includes a great deal of capital flows between the two countries, both businesses here investing in operations south of the border and Canadians investing their savings in equities and bonds and so on in US markets. There are hundreds of billions of
Including the
dollars.
Prime Minister and Brookfield.
Yeah, and rightly so. I mean, people should be allocating their investment in a way that is ideally broadly diversified, and so that means including a lot of U.S. operations. Their economy is 10 times the size of Canada, and so it's entirely normal for many of us to have considerable U.S. investments, say, as we should have investments in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. But the U.S., given its size and proximity, is going to be dominant in those flows. And so there was last year, I hope I don't get the number off the top of my head wrong, but something on the order of $250 billion just last year alone in investment flows from Canada to the United States. And that's actually low relative to some recent years. And so what the Prime Minister and the President were discussing was, maybe what the potential future might be for this economic relationship if we can settle down the policy uncertainty and have an arrangement that people can count on. Investment flows might increase between the two countries. And the Prime Minister quoted a number of about $1 trillion over the next 5 years, which is actually less than you'd guess, just based on recent years
clearly,
alone.
He wasn't saying we're going to write a check and send it to you.
No, that would certainly be something far beyond even the fiscal capacity of the federal government to do.
May I win? I mean, the crucial point here, Senator, is that capital flows from investors and businesses between the two countries. Some years, Canada's a net investor of a net importer of capital from the U.S., and other years we're a net exporter. It depends on various factors, including if there's a big transaction one year that might tip the scale. The key point here is that those outcomes are the result of market forces, of individuals and businesses and so on making decisions, not governments. And your question strikes at something even more fundamental that I see playing out in Canadian political economy and public policy circles, including on the right, it must be said, that worries me. And that is not just a focus on trying to diversify trade and investment with the United States. That may or may not be a good idea, but an increasing support for what you might characterize as economic nationalism. Sometimes it gets presented as economic sovereignty. We've heard digital sovereignty. We've heard all of this different nomenclature. But the idea that the right response to Donald Trump's autarky is for Canada to essentially match it with our own, trying to become self-reliant in the production of automobiles or whatever, is a path that I'm afraid we've gone down before in the 1970s, and it was a bad one. I mean, one way to think about Canadian political economy over the past 40 years or longer has been trying to reverse the ill effects of our previous bout with economic nationalism in the face of Richard Nixon and the Vietnam War and all the rest. One of my favorite stories from that era is, and your listeners and viewers should check this out, between 1974 and 1975, New Brunswick tried to build its own automobile, the Bricklin.
Yes, we remember.
And in some ways, I think the Bricklin is a metaphor for this idea that Canada should, for all intents and purposes, put walls up around itself and try to become self-sufficient. That's a path to not to prosperity. It's a path to stagnation. It's a path to a government-centric economy. And so when we start debating how much capital should be flowing from Canada into the United States, we're succumbing to this temptation that somehow it's politics and policy that should guide that, not markets and individuals.
And the issue is really for us the fact that we don't have enough inflow of foreign capital, foreign direct investment, and haven't had for a very long time. And this country. And that doesn't really have anything to do with Donald Trump. That's how complicated we make it, Sean.
But I worry. I worry increasingly. People are rejecting even that premise that that we've gone from aspiring to make the country's economy attractive to foreign investment. That's why we've lowered corporate taxes and other things, to now an increasingly mainstream view that foreign direct investment, particularly from the United States, is somehow bad. That was for a long time. I think it's fair to say, I'm not making a normative judgment, I'm making an observational one, generally an idea associated with more left-wing economic thinkers. What worries me is that's finding increasing resonance on the right, in part because the language isn't about fairness and equality and the types of things that people spoke about in the 70s. It's now about resilience and security and sovereignty, kind of right-coded language, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
I think if the takeaway for Canadian policymakers from Trump's threat is another bout of economic nationalism, we'll have fundamentally learned the wrong lesson from this episode.
Yeah,
Trevor, jump in.
I'll jump in there with complete agreement with Sean's concern here. That does worry me too. You can see indications of an increasing level of support for economic nationalism for sure, but I'm not sure we're there yet. Like, I see a lot of moves by many governments leaning into the need to make the economy more resilient and strengthen it, or in the Prime Minister's language, make Canada the strongest economy in the G7, which I'm not sure is possible, but
that's the trouble.
Put that aside.
We're not going to make that category.
The question for me is, and it's, it's too soon to know what direction the feds and provinces will move, but in how we go about executing on that kind of aspiration and that vision. And if we're deploying scarce public resources to support one industry or another, then that's pretty counterproductive in the sense that this can shift where investment goes and where workers go that are contrary to kind of the fundamentals determining how markets allocate workers and capital. And that can detract from our productivity and economic growth and therefore living standards and so on. But if provinces and the federal government pursue ways to try and liberalize the economy a little bit through reforms to internal trade that we've seen. A lot of momentum earlier this year. We'll see what the follow through is like, or if we have some tax reform federally, as the Liberal Party did commit to in the campaign, to do a systematic review of the business tax system. That might be pretty helpful to boost investment in Canada and therefore growth and productivity, but based on fundamentals rather than government trying to tilt the scales one way or another. But there is scope for government to try and lean in some directions because of the importance of infrastructure in a lot of areas. Our ability to trade with other countries, for example, is really limited by rail and port capacity. And expanding that necessarily involves a lot of government decisions and often a lot of government barriers these days, that if we can try and alleviate that, then it can achieve a kind of double dividend here of trade diversification that might have some decoupling from the states at the margin, and also boosting investment if these projects make sense. And then critical minerals, going back to the Australia deal, I wouldn't want to overstate the significance of that deal. It's pretty small and involves the governments deploying, both of them, roughly $1 billion in support of a couple of projects and setting some minimum price floors on some commodities. And that's something that you could see here too, to the extent that the Ring of Fire in Ontario may require some infrastructure.
That's my issue with it, is that and maybe I don't know all the facts, but Australia is basically saying, okay, we've signed the deal, we'll do it, we can give you the critical minerals. We have to go through the regulatory hoops and processes that we've put in our own way, and we can't sign that deal and say we're going to deliver this next week or even 2 years from now, because the process takes years.
Well, that's what I think we're waiting to see. It's kind of a government decision about whether or not we want to stick with the unworkable regulatory frameworks we have in a lot of different areas, or whether the government is going to push through them using C5, or fundamentally reforming the regulatory regime itself, which is definitely the preferred option.
I guess my point just is I'm less optimistic than Trevor. You get the sense that Trump's own use of protection and subsidies has given a permission structure to a lot of interests in Canada who've always wanted to make the case for their own protection and subsidies to now essentially be able to do that. And the net effect, to go back to our original conversation, is we are essentially trading off the interests of a manufactured industry, that is the electrical vehicle industry, one for which government has engineered both supply and demand, at the expense of our canola industry, which, as Trevor says, is one rooted in economic fundamentals. It is one of the largest global suppliers in the world. It's subject to huge global demand, and it is a good example of the trade-offs when governments try to effectively through dictates decide how our economy should be structured, as opposed to letting markets make those decisions.
This is my question, and we're going to go into some of the economic fundamentals sort of pre-budget in a moment. But, I understand why Doug Ford wants to support the auto sector. I get that. I understand why my part of the world likes agriculture and energy, because we are the hewers of wood and drawers of water, and I don't see that as a negative. I see that as a positive, that we have built markets for decades with those two things. But we still seem to have that central Canadian view that the auto sector in Ontario is more important than anything else at this point, and we are subsidizing and compromising other relationships in order to preserve that in the short term. As I say, Trevor, I get Doug Ford doing that. I'm not sure I get Ottawa doing that.
So I share your sentiment there, and ideally, I would like to see the federal government in Canada have less of a regional focus. I mean, part of that is because we have two parties, both conservatives and liberals, that are fairly regionally concentrated and do not have like uniform national support in different provinces, and so may favor some set of policies that naturally benefit some regions more than others. But throughout Canada's history, we are a country that has very different regional economic experiences. Some areas booming while others are effectively in a recession, very different economic structures that not perfectly, but almost uncorrelated with each other when you look at the data in terms of which provinces are growing in what year and which are shrinking. So it's really hard for federal policy to equally benefit all parts of the country. There's often regional trade-offs being made, no question. And with trade, that is absolutely the case too. Not new. Think back to McDonald's and tariffs boosting manufacturing in central Canada, costing farmers because of the increases that it meant to imported machinery and equipment, for example. So not new debates, but we ought to be, and I share Sean's perspective there, having the debates openly, like supply management. I'm not a big fan, but it is something that we talk about all the time. And Canadians, for the most part, I think it's fair to say, don't care that their milk is too expensive. And so you can see how the government made that choice. But
especially if it means jeopardizing a relationship. But Sean, to that point, just to follow up, when I hear a federal minister say, for example, on the whole question of pipelines going from Alberta to the Pacific coast, and he goes, "Oh well, that's for Alberta and BC to work out." And I guess my gut says, no, that's the role and job of a federal government to make those decisions in the national interest. It's not just can't be left to players to have a fight on the sidelines.
Yeah, my former boss, Brian Lee Crowley, used to often say the only thing that was created new in 1867 was a national government, a government that would stitch together these disparate provinces and overcome the narcissism of small differences that tends to result from a collection of subnational jurisdictions, each with their own interests and perspectives and preferences, and so on. And so in some ways, solving those interprovincial disputes about national projects is not tangential to the role of the federal government. It's like its basic purpose. If it doesn't do that, in my mind, it raises questions for Albertans, like, what is this all for? If Alberta is going to have to enter into commercial arrangements with Canadian provinces in order to get right-of-ways to build pipelines, then it might as well do that outside the country, retain the resources that it net contributes to Canada, and do those deals on a commercial basis, as opposed to one as part of a belonging to a country. I say that only partly with hyperbole in mind, but yeah, it is a fundamental issue. Now, again, I worked in politics. I know how difficult these things are. Yes. I don't want to minimize the trade-offs. The Carney government has much greater support in British Columbia than it does in Alberta, and so a straight political read would produce the outcome that Minister Hodgson set out. But as you say, Senator Wallin, sometimes there are things more fundamental than politics, and standing up for the Constitution and standing up for the fundamental role of the federal government has to be one of those things.
Trevor, just a quick word on the Keystone. Danielle Smith made it pretty clear in her early discussions with Trump, and I think she was pretty successful. But, you know, the guy likes a big deal. He likes something big and flashy, and I think her advice was, raise Keystone. That allows Trump to say, oh, Obama was a fool and Biden was a fool, and let's do it. It gives him his political win. But also, if we're not going to be able to ship things east and west through pipelines, then we might as well continue to ship it south. What do you think on Keystone? Is it going to happen?
So the premier in Alberta here does have a fairly ambitious goal of increasing the amount of oil production in the province. It will require not just one, but two and potentially more additional pipelines just to have the capacity to ship it out. And my understanding of her position, I don't want to put words in her mouth, is that east, west, south, all of the above is
wherever
is quite welcome. Now, many do raise the critique about Keystone that it further deepens the economic relationship between Canada and the U.S. And sure, yeah, it certainly does. But this is a valuable market for us. And the fact that we sell a lot to the U.S. in terms of oil, that's not the cause of the differential in price between what producers in Alberta and other producers in Canada receive. That's really determined by transportation costs. So a pipeline like Keystone is as valuable for producers here as a pipeline to the West Coast or to the East Coast in Canada. But it does then expose us to policy risks south of the border. We certainly don't have a smooth regulatory process when it comes to pipelines within Canada, but Keystone is also one of these big symbolic projects that in the U.S. We saw it approved and then rejected and then approved again, and it's not going to be completed in 3 years. And so even if we started construction on a new Keystone XL 2.0 now, it's not going to be finished, and you could easily see the presidential permit being pulled if, say, the Democrats take the White House next time around, as Biden did last time around. And so it's really hard to see how a private proponent would put billions of dollars at risk from just a single presidential election outcome in the U.S., which, of course, is so hard to predict. And so I'm not sure that project is feasible in the short term just because of the uncertainty. But Alberta, as it's signaled its willingness to be the proponent for these kind of projects. And does the government take on that risk? That'll be something to watch.
Sean, a word on Churchill. This seems to have been added magically to the list of national projects in the last few days. Again, to your point earlier about how we find these things out accidentally as opposed to there being an intelligent communication strategy. What do you make of that?
Yeah,
the Churchill project.
It speaks to that point. It also speaks to a broader challenge for the Carney government, which is its technocratic impulse. I think of C5, its reform to the major project regime, as well as its principal or its signature housing policy, the Build Canada Homes Agency. It's kind of one and the same for the following reason, Senator. In both cases, the government is broadly diagnosing the problem correct. In the case of major projects, the process it needs to be streamlined and expedited and shot through with greater clarity. With respect to housing, the problem is we have a supply-demand disequilibrium that involves ostensibly both trying to address demand-side issues through immigration reform, but as importantly, trying to supercharge housing construction in the country. In both instances, the government has gone about solving for its diagnosis in technocratic ways. In the case of C5, instead of fundamentally reforming the system, it has essentially established a parallel track, a new system that rests on top of the pre-existing one, that certain projects that the government decides can avail itself of. So not solving the problem as it is and then letting markets decide which projects go forward, but instead having this top-down politicized process where certain projects are stuck with the crummy old system and the ones that the government likes get the new system. With respect to the housing file, instead of working with other orders of government to liberalize land use or cut development fees or those other types of policies you would get at to try to enable markets to bring supply and demand into equilibrium, the government has created a new crown agency that is going to, at least in some cases, manufacture homes or subsidize the manufacture of homes. So I would say if I was criticizing the Carney government or critiquing it, I would say on one hand, its diagnosis of the problem on these fundamental issues is closer to the truth than the Trudeau government. The biggest challenge for the government may be that its technocratic instincts when it comes to solutions may actually make it difficult for the government to deliver on its own commitments to address these issues that are really at the kind of foundation of Canada's economic challenges.
Yeah, this is the problem. We kind of had a major projects office and we kind of have a way to deal with housing. And now we've got a new fraud squad agency to fight financial crime. And we already had that with FinTrack. Like, it just seems we're creating new bureaucracies, pulling people out of different departments and putting them in new offices with new titles. But that is not economic activity, except, I guess, if you look at the stats that public sector employment is up to 22% of total employment. Trevor, this is not the kind of employment we want.
Yeah, and how I'm viewing this is perhaps overly generous, but maybe it's just my optimistic bias. These moves that we're seeing are to cut through, as Sean put it, the crummy old system really quickly in the short term. You really
are being optimistic, Trevor.
And then the question to me is then, does the government reform the regulatory procedures and processes, which takes time? And I think we don't really have the luxury of time, given how large the economic challenges that we face, Trump aside, the productivity challenge, the fact that we've had stagnant growth for a decade. The government needed to move and move quickly. And some of the projects, to the extent that their infrastructure, port expansions in Montreal, elsewhere, very valuable, kind of no-brainers. So put them on a special track while doing the hard work of standing up a completely new system that is efficient, quick, certain, providing decisions, not necessarily positive. Just if you want to give a no early on. Don't drag things out for years and years. And if the government does that, then that kind of sequencing may very well be optimal. I think that's the question, though. Do we see something in the budget that is committing to significant tax and regulatory reform? If not the budget, do we see it in the spring? If not in the spring, well, then my optimism will
I mean, we'll see
evaporate.
The funding for these new bureaucbecause, but that is not activity.
Yes, Senator, may I take the liberty of asking Trevor a question?
Sure.
Because Trevor is such a big economic brain. Like, Trevor, one of the clear motivations behind the Trump tariff policy isn't just to use them as negotiating chips. It's to change the economics of production in North America such that investors and businesses operating in Canada decide to shift capital and production to the U.S. in order to jump the tariff wall and access the U.S. market. The major announcement last week from Stellantis is obviously one of the highest profile examples, but it's not the only one, and it may not be the only one. In a world in which investors and businesses are making judgments about where to locate in production or expand production, what does Canadian policy need to do, not just to deal with our pre-existing competitiveness issues, but to almost overcorrect such that you're accounting for the inherent incentives in Trump's tariffs? And I would just make one other contextual point. Because of the nature of Trump's politics, when companies shift capital and production to the U.S., they aren't going to do it quietly. They're going to do it as loudly and as high profile as possible, precisely because they want the president to see it. And my biggest fear is that creates a vicious cycle where competitors and other industry players feel some small p political pressure to match. And the net effect is a sucking sound of capital and production from Canada to the U.S. And so in that world, Trevor, do we need to do something more radical than anyone in Ottawa is talking about right now?
So the core challenge...
Good question, John.
Yeah.
Thanks, Senator.
The core challenge that creates for Canada is, in my view, one or twofold. One, uncertainty. And uncertainty is the big drag on investment for Canada. We've seen a big spike in the level of uncertainty this year and a big drop in business investment. Fully rational on the part of those who maybe are pausing to wait to see where the dust settles. If the uncertainty is resolved in a way that features large U.S. tariffs and does not feature a Canada-U.S. free trade agreement, then what do policymakers here need to do? I think it is to lean much more heavily into providing the kind of certainty that many sectors need in order to make large-scale investment in Canada. That means getting our own policy house in order very quickly and getting it in order in a way that would be clearly robust to changes in government. What the details of that looks like, I'm not sure. But the U.S. is... regardless of what the Trump administration puts forward or what political opponents offer to voters in the midterm or the next presidential election, it's fair to say that government in the U.S. is unstable and therefore uncertain. Things move dramatically from one party to the next in terms of policy. So our advantage can be one of stability. And this matters a lot for some sectors. Think about high-skilled sectors. If our immigration system can be reformed in a way that returns to an economic focus, a skills focus, one that is, again, stable, has bipartisan support, that's an advantage for sectors that need to recruit and retain talent. They might locate in Toronto or Washington or Calgary or elsewhere. And some staff in those offices on the Canadian side of the border may be located there as a hedge against dramatic immigration policy changes in the U.S., as we're seeing, just as one example. And then tax policy, ensuring that competitiveness here is always materially better than in the United States. But it's certainly a challenge, but I wouldn't overstate the
That's the point I'm getting to, the last point you made. Like, in a world where Stellantis is looking at a generally, I'm using Stellantis, of course, as a proxy, is looking at generally more competitive environment, some right to work, low taxation, higher productivity, etc. And now they choosing between Canada and the U.S. On one side of the border, their imports are subject to tariffs. On the other side, they're not. Isn't that such an attractive kind of mix of policy conditions that it's not enough for us to have a corporate tax rate that is a couple percentage points lower or whatever? I mean, don't we have to do something kind of radical, Trevor?
Yeah. Whether we would characterize what we need to do as radical or not is maybe a separate question. But let me give some context around what would it look like for Canada's economy if the U.S. has broad 25% tariffs on everything that we trade with them, our economy would be smaller, for sure. How much smaller? Maybe 2 to 2.5% smaller. And that's significant, but it's not existential. Think about the productivity challenge that we've accumulated over the past decade. Had we simply kept pace with, forget the US, but the OECD average of
everybody,
advanced industrial countries, we'd be 14% larger in terms of our economy. So absolutely domestic policy in terms of taxes, in terms of a stable and predictable regulatory environment, getting internal trade right. And that really does mean provinces doing much more than even they've committed to this year, having an immigration system that is skills and biased towards economic outcomes. We can absolutely grow productivity and therefore the economy by more than what 25% tariffs.
Yeah. Look, I think this is the conclusion that we all keep reaching, depending on what the fight is on any given week about this, is that a lot of these issues we're facing really don't have much to do with Donald Trump. These have been long simmering, growing more serious issues that are homegrown, that we tend to cut off our nose to spite our face on some of these policies. But it has left us, as we face a budget with kind of a magic trick, and I'll have you do a brief comment on that, Trevor, which is if we call it an operational budget or a capital budget, if you're borrowing money to spend, it still equals debt. You can call it whatever you want. Are people going to fall for that or buy that or be comforted by it?
Yeah, well, first, as a generic point, capital and operating expenditures should be treated differently. But they are. When the government is putting money towards a long-lived piece of asset that'll generate benefits in the future, it gradually expenses that over time. It amortizes that, as private businesses do, as is entirely appropriate. What I think the government will end up doing in the budget, though, is going far beyond that and will be characterizing a great deal of spending as investment.
Right.
And that'll just be a pure communications exercise. And whether successful or not, I'll have to lead that to others who understand public relations and public opinion formation a little better than I do. But economically, you're right. I mean, if it's cash out the door, that does mean higher levels of public debt. And what the long-term concern is that I have, that the PBO raised recently, and that I think Canadians should increasingly have in mind is, are we growing public debt faster than the economy itself? And at least the projections of my own of the PBO, and I suspect the budget when it comes out will have for the next few years public debt growing faster than the economy. And that's not sustainable. And we'll need to make changes on the spending side or the revenue side, and people agree or disagree on the combination of that, but we're not on a sustainable trajectory, and that means something at some point we'll have to give.
Well, this is, the modern monetary theorists who have been saying for the last couple of years, let's just, we'll print money. If we need more money, we'll just print money. It's not a problem. We're a 40 million person country, give or take some here, Sean, and debt levels over $1 trillion and deficits. I don't know. The numbers keep changing every day, but somewhere between 65 and 100. We're going to get those numbers, before the budget. This does not seem sustainable to me. I mean, you have people like David Dodge, I saw the other day, saying, in his own tactful way, Carney has a much more difficult problem than we had in 94, 95. We even had the governor of the bank, Tiff Macklem, warning about, slow growth and lower product.
Yes.
And then you've got other people screaming out loud, which is, look at the unemployment figures, people. Look at, the GDP, the debt ratios, right? We make 70% of what the average American makes. This is why people are feeling like there's an economic crisis.
Yeah, let me just say a few things. I'll try to be as brief as I can. Just first, on the subject of the budget's accounting presentation, I don't have any insider knowledge, but I suspect one of the reasons we didn't see a fall statement in June before the recess, and why the budget has been pushed back a bit in the fall is because the Department of Finance, which takes its responsibility for protecting Canada's international reputation with respect to accounting standards and fiscal policy seriously, has resisted the government's own commitment to move in this direction. And the compromise, as I understand it, is, well, it will disaggregate the government spending projections in between investment and consumption, or investment and spending. It will still, at the end, reconcile all the numbers together so we can see. And my own interpretation is that's finance asserting itself and saying, we're not gonna let you ultimately kind of monkey with the way that we do fiscal policy in Canada. And if so, it's a credit to the public servants there who take their job seriously.
And I think the PBO was making the same point, like quite vociferously.
Yeah, that was my experience. We could talk about this another time. That's my experience in Ottawa, that there's a tendency to assume the political arm of the government asserts itself and the system sort of does what it's told. There is an institutional understanding of itself and its role as a kind of durable institution in our society. And this might be an example where finance said, We'll go this far, but we won't go any further. Full stop. On the broader structural problem, the one way I've come to think about it, I don't know if this resonates with the two of you, is that the fundamental problem facing Canadian fiscal policy is that we have Justin Trudeau's spending preferences and Stephen Harper's tax rates, and that just cannot go on in perpetuity. At some point, we either need to adjust what we're prepared to pay in exchange for the government services we want, or vice versa, and this just can't go on indefinitely. As Trevor says, it creates a structural and unsustainable fiscal trajectory. The last point, though, which just takes up your observations about Mr. Dodge, people forget that as heroic as the Creched-Martin cuts were, a fast-rising economy also did a lot of the work of pulling Canada out of the fiscal challenges that we faced in the 1990s. And so in the absence of that kind of economic growth, it puts even greater pressure on the government to try to reconcile or solve this gap between spending as a share of GDP and tax revenues as a share of GDP. Economic growth will not play the role that it's done in the past in helping to close that gap.
The stat, well, I read so many of them on any given day, but 40 out of, Canada's heading for this, I think by the end of the decade, 40 out of 40 in the list of OECD countries in terms of real GDP per capita. So, Trevor, people feel that when we hear David Coletto talk about that sense of precarity and people really living in an anxious state. There's a reason why they are.
That's right. And when people say real GDP per capita, it does sound like an abstract statistical data point that economists like to look at and reference, but it connects directly and consistently with hourly labor compensation. And so if you look over time, the growth of what workers earn, inflation adjusted per hour on average, it tracks with real GDP almost perfectly. Sorry, real GDP per capita almost perfectly. And that tracks almost perfectly with labor productivity. And so ultimately, when you hear words productivity or GDP per capita, I'd encourage listeners just to think earnings. What you can buy with what you make each hour. And so if we can't boost growth and productivity, then our living standards won't grow either. And that's ultimately the affordability challenge in my mind, a much more significant one even than the spike in inflation. Prices rising, that means our paychecks do not go as far as they otherwise would, but our paychecks not growing as quickly as they could. It's actually a bigger problem. It's just not as visible a one.
Yes, well said.
So here we are, facing this budget, and it is, you might not like the word, Trevor, but We do need some radical things. Now, we've seen some radical ideas out there, like the Polish saying they're going to lift income tax on people that have kids because we all need to grow our populations. I don't know what the details of that really are. And meanwhile, we're still propping up the post office. Sean, give us one radical idea that we need to see in the budget.
Yeah, well, I have a lot of radical ideas, Senator Wallin. They're in a binder here on my desk. One idea that I personally am drawn to. We've written a bit about it at the Hub. Is some of your listeners and viewers will know that we have a lifetime capital gains exemption.
Right.
I think it's about $800,000 at present. It's linked to it grows with inflation, and it's often used, for instance, when people are disposing of a business or maybe disposing of a farm or whatever. I've been drawn to the idea of matching the lifetime capital gains exemption with a lifetime income tax exemption that would say something like on your first $250,000 of income earned, it'll be shielded from federal and provincial taxation. That we have a collective interest in people's transition from education to employment, whatever education that is. That's a formative period in their lives to pay off student loans, start to save for a down payment or whatever. And that we're going to shield that first $250,000 or whatever the quantum ultimately is from taxation. I think it would do a number of things. One of which it would start to rebalance the generational distribution of scarce public resources. Right now, our governments tilt disproportionately to older Canadians, and I think that has played out a bit in our politics. And one way to address that, to rebalance things, would be to say we have a collective interest in people starting to save or pay off debt or whatever in this formative period in their lives, and we're going to grant a lifetime exemption from income tax of, say, $250,000.
Is that too radical for you, Trevor?
I'll tell you my radical idea is even crazier. Even crazier. Make a plan and stick with it. That would be just a sea change compared to what we've done, and not just the federal government, but certain provinces too. And a lot of our fiscal challenges are around just not sticking with the government's own plans. And just to illustrate
from last week. Yeah.
Yeah. Every time we get a budget or a fiscal update, the whole trajectory of the government changes. It's like any forward-looking statement in the past on, at least as far as public finances have been concerned, is just immediately put in the bin a few months later. And just to illustrate that, this year, the latest numbers on total expenses of the government, let me just make sure I don't get this wrong, is about $550 billion. Whereas the very first fiscal plan for this year, post-COVID, I should note as well, had 466. And so just changing, what the government was planning to do in future years is basically accounting for the entire deficit that we see and more. And so hopefully what we get from this next budget and plans to come is that serious plans that aim at a clear objective that the government sticks with over time. And it's maybe a sad state of affairs to say that is radical, but
it is very radical. Don't you agree, Sean? That's extremely radical.
Yeah, it is. As Trevor says, we've had, you'll recall, Senator Wallin, in the 1980s, there was a tendency for the government's projections to show a balanced budget. And then as they approached it, that year always got kicked out. We've not had that problem over the past decade because no one's projected a balanced budget per se. No. But as Trevor says, every year, spending growth grows faster and faster as we get closer to the in year, if I can put it that way, and trying to establish a real discipline that is not just a forecast, but actually manifests itself would be a good thing. But if I can bring back to something I said earlier, a big part of it is bringing Canadians along.
I agree.
Understand the nature of the trade-offs. The deficit, if projections, if estimates are right, could be something approaching $100 billion, which is significant given that we are not technically in a recession, that there are no kind of extraordinary circumstances that are disproportionately driving that, and so it really comes back to the point. Canadians need to tell us what kind of fiscal policy do they want. Do they want a fiscal policy like Denmark and that they're prepared to pay for it, or do they want a fiscal policy like somewhere else and that brings spending ambitions in line with what they're prepared to pay for? Until Canadians give us that answer, politicians are going to solve for that gap by deficits and borrowing, and that is not a long-term sustainable way to try to interpret what Canadians want from their government.
Yeah, and I don't want to end on a really negative note, but I did look at the cover story in The Economist, which basically said governments everywhere are going broke. So, we need to get a handle on this. Great. Well, I'm going to say wonderful talking to you too. It is because you're smart, but also this is not really making us all feel really good. So. But we will carry on and we will watch this budget. So Sean Speer, the editor-in-chief at The Hub and one of the co-founders, and Trevor, who, well, I don't know, you've got so many titles, but it's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, but this co-director of the Finances of the Nation, which is a project where researchers work with the Canadian Tax Foundation to really come up with some good ideas. And probably you've suggested there that governments actually, if they find a good idea, stick with it for a minute and a half. So,
indeed.
Anyway,
it was great to be on. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see you again very soon. And thanks to all of you for joining us today for this edition of No Nonsense. We'll see you again soon.